Thank you so much, viewers, for joining us for this YouTube Live. We're so happy to see Dr. Frank Turek, who's an American apologist. He's an author, public speaker, and he's the founder and the president of this organization called Cross-Examine. I personally, it's truly a blessing for me, to watch your videos in YouTube. I mean, when I was very sick, I used to watch all your small videos that you post in your YouTube channel, and that was truly a blessing for me. We're so happy to have you, Dr. Frank.
Thank you, Lloyd. Thanks for having me.
Without further talk, let's directly move into the topic. Why Christianity is the one true religion. It's over to you, Doctor.
All right. Well, let me just kind of give an overview because that's a great question. We wrote a book a number of years ago called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And what I'm going to do here in the next few minutes is just sort of summarize what's in this book. It's 448 pages, so I can't do it justice just here on this Zoom or this live stream. But there are four basic questions you need to answer to try and discover whether or not Christianity is true. The first question is, does truth exist? The second question is, does God exist, the God? Third question is, are miracles possible? And the fourth question is the New Testament reliable enough to let us know if Jesus rose from the dead? Because if the answer to those four questions is yes, that truth does exist, that God does exist, that miracles are possible, and that Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is true. And so what we do in this book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, is we go through the evidence that the answer to those four questions is yes. And we also do this on college campuses and at churches. And if people want to see a longer presentation of this, if they go to our YouTube channel at crossexamine.org and click on any of the 2+ hour links from a college campus, because we do this a lot on college campuses, Lloyd, they can kind of see a presentation that goes into more depth than what I can do right here on this live stream. But the first question, does truth exist, is important because if there's no truth, then obviously Christianity can't be true. Of course, if there's no truth, atheism can't be true, or Hinduism or Islam or any other worldview couldn't be true either, right? If there was no truth, you wouldn't go to school. You wouldn't read books. You wouldn't try and learn from others, because if everything was a matter of opinion and there was no truth, then you wouldn't do any of those things. Of course, when people claim there is no truth, they're actually uttering a truth claim. So if someone says there's no truth, you're going to ask that person a question. Is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. This is what we call in logic a self-defeating statement. It would be like me saying I can't speak a word in English, right? If I were to say that, what would you say? You would say, well, you just use English to say it, right? It's a self-defeating statement. So of course there's truth. Any claim that denies truth is defeating itself because it claims to be true that there's no truth. And so we spent a lot of time in the book going through self-defeating statements like there's no truth, all truth is relative, there are no absolutes, you can't know truth, you ought not judge. All these claims are actually self-defeating because they all do exactly what they say can't be done. When they say you can't know anything, they're claiming you can know that, right? When they say all truth is relative, they don't think that's a relative truth. They think that's absolute. When they say there are no absolutes, that's actually an absolute truth claim. When they say you ought not judge, that's actually a judgment, right? So they're doing the things that they say they can't do. So that's question one. Does truth exist? The answer is yes. All right. The next question, does God exist, is a question that we normally deal with by offering three arguments. The first argument is the argument from the beginning of the universe, known as the cosmological argument. The second argument is the argument from the design of the universe, known as the teleological argument. It's also an argument that talks about the design in living things like me and you and other living things, that there's design in life. The third argument is the argument from morality, known as the moral argument. And it says if there's one thing morally wrong out there, just one, say it's wrong to torture babies for fun, or it's wrong to murder people, then there has to be a God. Why? Because if there is no God, if there is no standard beyond us, then everything would just be a matter of opinion. It would be just your opinion against somebody else's opinion. But we know that murder, for example, isn't just a matter of opinion. It's really wrong. If that's the case, there must be a standard beyond human beings that is a standard of goodness and righteousness, and we're obligated to obey that standard. And any deviation from that standard would be what we would call evil. That standard can only exist if God exists. Otherwise, everything's just a matter of opinion. Now, let me just say a couple of things about the first two arguments, the cosmological argument and the teleological argument. The cosmological argument says that if the universe had a beginning, it basically must have had a beginner. Now, even atheists today, Lloyd, are admitting that the universe had a beginning, that space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing. Even Stephen Hawking, who was a top atheist physicist until he died about 4 or 5 years ago, said almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. There was a beginning. If there was a beginning, there must be a beginner. I don't have time to go through the evidence for that. It's all in the book, but it's not controversial. Even atheists are admitting the universe had a beginning. The second argument is the argument from design. As I said, the teleological argument. And this shows that from the very beginning to right now, the universe is precisely designed, precisely, we might say, tweaked to allow life to exist here on Earth and to even allow a universe at all. That if you were to change any one of a number of factors about our universe, virtually imperceptibly, there would be no universe, or there would be no universe that could support life. For example, if the expansion rate of the universe was different from the very beginning, by 1 part in 1,000 million, we couldn't exist. And this is what Stephen Hawking, the atheist, admits. He says, if you were to change the expansion rate from the very beginning, an imperceptible amount, the universe would have collapsed back on itself or never developed galaxies, which means we wouldn't be here. And there are several other of these factors. Change them just slightly, we don't exist. So when you look at the cosmological argument from the beginning of the universe, the design argument from the design of the universe and the design in life, and the moral argument, you come away with a being that is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent, and moral, who created and sustains the entire universe to this very moment. And you get those attributes of God without even referencing any religious book. This is what we call in theology, natural theology. You don't need the Bible to know this. You just know this by creation. You know this by design. You know this by moral intuition, that these attributes must exist in a being beyond the world, a being that created and sustains the world. Let me put it a different way, just so I'm throwing a lot of information at you in a short period of time. So let me just put it in a different way. If space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing, which even atheists admit, then whatever created space, time, and matter can't be made of space, time, and matter. In other words, there must be a cause outside of space, time, and matter, which brought the universe into existence. What attributes must this cause have? The cause must be spaceless, because it created space, timeless, because it created time, immaterial, because it created material, must be intelligent to create the universe in such a precise way out of nothing, must be powerful, obviously, to create out of nothing, must also be personal in order to choose to create, because to go from a state of nothing to a state of creation, someone had to make a choice, and only persons can make choices. So I always ask people this question, Lloyd. When you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent, and moral cause, who do you think of? And the answer is God, right? Now, people will say, well, how do you know it's the Christian God? How do you know it's not some other God? And the answer is, we don't. We don't know what God this is at this point. It could be the Christian God, but this could also be someone like Allah at this point, right? This could just be a theistic God that isn't the Christian God. The only way we know it's the Christian God is if we continue to do research. We don't know this is the Christian God yet, but if we keep going through the other two questions, are miracles possible? And did Jesus rise from the dead? Then we can see that the same being that walked out of the tomb 1,988 years ago is the same being that created the universe out of nothing by his divine nature way back in the past at the creation event. So from the cosmological, teleological, and moral arguments, you get a being which could be the Christian God, but you don't know if it is without continuing to do more research. So let's go to the third question then. After does truth exist? Does God exist? The third question is, are miracles possible? And of course, a lot of people don't think miracles are possible because they may not see them today, or they think for some reason they're impossible. Well, actually, I normally ask people this question: what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? And most people will say the resurrection, but actually the resurrection is not the greatest miracle in the Bible. The greatest miracle in the Bible is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that verse is true, every other verse in the Bible is at least possible, right? Because if God can create the universe out of nothing, then he can do whatever he wants that's not logically impossible inside the universe. I mean, if he can create the universe out of nothing, can he raise Jesus from the dead? Of course he can. Can he walk on water? Of course he can. Can he part the Red Sea? Of course he can. He can do any of those things if he can create the universe out of nothing. Well, the interesting thing, Lloyd, is that even atheists are admitting the evidence for the first miracle. They're admitting that space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing. Now, they don't think it's God, but any explanation they give doesn't work. The best explanation, if space, time, and matter had a beginning, is that we have a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent, and then moral, from the moral argument, first cause. Okay, so yes, miracles are possible because the greatest miracle has already occurred, the creation of the universe out of nothing. Now, one reason people don't believe in miracles is because they've never seen one. Well, there's a lot of things you believe in that you've never seen. For example, you believe in your mind. Have you ever seen it? No. You believe in the laws of logic. Have you ever seen those? No. You believe in love. Have you ever seen love? No, you haven't seen love. You may have loved somebody, you may have been loved, but you've never seen love because it's not a physical thing. It's not something you see. You sense, but you don't see it. You believe in gravity. Have you ever seen gravity? Sure, Frank, look, that's gravity right there. You're dropping that thing. No, you're not seeing gravity. What are you seeing? You're seeing the effects of gravity, right? We really don't even know what gravity is, believe it or not. We don't know what it is, but we see its effects. Same thing is true with God. You don't see him directly, you see his effects. That's how we know God exists. We see an effect known as creation. We reason back to a cause, a creator. We see an effect known as design. We reason back to a cause, a designer. We see an effect known as the moral law. Certain things are right and wrong. We reason back to an effect of moral lawgiver. And this is how scientists reason. They see effects, they reason back to a cause. So we know God by his effects. And if space, time, and matter had a beginning, that's the effect. The cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent, and moral, given the moral argument. And by the way, you've never seen a historical figure like Napoleon, right? Or you've never seen an historical figure in your own country. You've never seen Gandhi personally, right? He's long been dead. But you know Gandhi existed. Why? Because he's left effects behind that are best explained by a person known as Gandhi who existed in history. Well, the same thing is true with Jesus. You've never seen Jesus physically, but he's left effects behind that are best explained by an historical person known as Jesus. So that's how we know God exists. That's how we know that Jesus existed. He's left effects behind. Now, the other thing that about miracles that people don't seem to get is that if miracles do occur, they have to be rare. Why do they have to be rare? Because if they happened all the time, they wouldn't get our attention as special acts of God. And those are the reasons that miracles exist. They exist to say this is a special act of God that should get our attention. For example, why should people follow Moses? Because Moses can do miracles. Why should people follow Elijah and Elijah? Because they can do miracles. Why should people follow Jesus and the apostles? Because they can do miracles. They're getting confirmation from God. The miracle confirms the message. The sign confirms the sermon. Without those miracles, why should we believe in Moses, Elijah, and Jesus and the apostles? They're there for a reason, to get our attention. And if miracles happened all the time, they wouldn't get our attention. Imagine if people rose from the dead routinely. What would the resurrection of Christ mean? Nothing. You go to somebody and you go, Jesus rose from the dead for your sins. And the guy goes, so what? Uncle Lloyd just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago, right? Now I got to give the inheritance back. No. It's got to be a rare event if it's going to get our attention. If it happened all the time, it wouldn't be a rare event and it wouldn't be a direct pointer back to God necessarily. We'd say, hey, these things happen all the time. All right. Now, the fourth question is, really, did Jesus rise from the dead? What evidence do we have that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, there's so much evidence here, I can't even abbreviate it because it would take too long. But let me just point out one fact to you about the New Testament writers. All of the New Testament writers, with the exception of Luke, they were all believers in Yahweh. They already thought they were God's chosen people. Here's my question. Why would they invent a resurrected Jesus? First of all, these people did not believe that a man could claim to be God. That would be blasphemy. Secondly, they did not believe that a man would rise from the dead in the middle of time. They thought a man would rise from the dead at the end of time, but not in the middle of time. And so these are two beliefs that went against their Judaism. There were several other beliefs that went against their Judaism, yet they said that Jesus rose from the dead. Why would they invent this? Did they get anything good by saying it happened? Like, for example, today, people tend to lie or invent things to get good things. The three big motivators that motivate people to lie, cheat, and steal are sex, money, and power. Question: did the New Testament writers get sex, money, or power by saying Jesus had risen from the dead? No, they didn't get any of those things. In fact, with regard to power, they didn't get power at all. Paul had power when he was a persecutor of Jesus, and he got persecuted when he became a follower of Jesus. So none of the classic motivators that motivate people to sin, to invent things, they got. They didn't get sex, they didn't get money, they didn't get power. What they got is they got kicked out of the synagogue and then they got beaten, tortured, and killed. This is not a list of benefits that people will sin for, right? It's counterintuitive to say they invented this. And then, of course, they went and died for it, which shows that they really believed it happened. In fact, here is a point I like to make to kind of sum it up. The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. You wouldn't have a New Testament written by Jews in the first century that claimed that Jesus rose from the dead. Because, as I say, they just got beaten, tortured, and killed for saying so. Unless he really rose from the dead, they never would have written the New Testament. They're Jews. What do they have to get out of this? Nothing. They had everything to lose by saying it was true. Another point that I think is important to believe or to consider is this. we don't believe that Christianity is true because we've collected a series of books and we put them under one binding and we call the Bible. Christianity is not true because this ancient collection of books says it's true. Christianity is true because an event occurred, the resurrection. There would be no book unless the event occurred. In other words, Christianity would be true if the Bible never existed. Now, we wouldn't know much about it unless the Bible did exist, but it would still be true even if the Bible had never been written. Because the fact that Jesus rose from the dead can be established on historical grounds, part of them obviously coming from the New Testament documents as historical documents. We're not assuming they're inerrant by looking at what they say. We conclude they're inerrant based on the testimony of Jesus, but those documents were written because Jesus rose from the dead. They were not written as a way of inventing the resurrection. That would make no sense. I mean, obviously, do you realize Paul was a Christian before he wrote his books? And Matthew was a Christian before he wrote the Gospel of Matthew, and John was a Christian before he wrote the Gospel of John. Why? Not because they read a book, but because they witnessed an event, the resurrected Jesus. That's why they wrote him down. You know, there were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written. Why? Because they witnessed an event. The New Testament writers wrote it down so we later generations would know it. But by writing it down, they didn't create the event. They were writing it down because they were responding to the event known as the resurrection. Okay. Now, if Jesus rose from the dead, and the evidence shows he did, then whatever he teaches is true. Jesus taught the entire Old Testament as the word of God, and he promised the New Testament. So I believe that the Bible's the word of God on Jesus's authority because I just have a personal policy. If someone rises from the dead, I just trust whatever the guy says. And Jesus rose from the dead. He said the Old Testament was the word of God and he promised the New Testament. That's why I believe the collection we call the Bible is God's word on his authority from the historically reliable documents that tell us this. Okay. Now, Paul famously said in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, your faith is in vain. Everything is centered around the resurrection. If he rose from the dead, Christianity is true. If he didn't rise from the dead, it's false. This is unique among world religions. You can actually use historical evidence to show it's true or it's false. Okay? If Jesus rose, it's true. If he didn't, it's false. Now, there's a lot more in the book that we don't have time to get into here, but that's kind of a summary. Truth does exist. God does exist. Miracles are therefore possible. Jesus rose from the dead, and whatever he teaches is true. That's why we trust the Bible. So maybe we can go to questions from there. Does that make sense? You're muted. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions now.
Okay.
I mean, I think you've already addressed, but we just want you to unpack that a little bit more. How can the Bible be inerrant if it has been written, copied, and transmitted by mere human beings?
Okay, when someone says that, well, first of all, the Bible does not need to be inerrant for Christianity to be true. Now, I do believe it is inerrant because Jesus did. And again, I just agree with Jesus because he's the authority, right? But you can find mistakes. If there are mistakes in the Bible, they don't disprove the overall narrative that there is a God, you are not him. Jesus came, rose from the dead, lived a perfect life and died in your place. And by trusting in him, you can be forgiven and given his righteousness. All that goes through, even if you find an error on who got to the tomb first or whatever, whatever people are going to say. So, but just because men create errors sometimes doesn't mean they always create errors. Do you know there are other inerrant books out there other than the Bible? A book that has no mistakes in it is inerrant. A lot of math books are inerrant. You know that? if all the problems in there are solved properly, it's an inerrant book. Okay. So when people say, I can't believe the Bible because it's been written by men, one question I ask them, then why should I believe what you just said? Because you're a man. Does that mean everything you say is in error? No, it's not. Sometimes we err, but we don't inevitably err. Sometimes we get it right. And of course, I think the Bible writers got it right. And if they had God's help, obviously they could certainly get it right.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. We have a next question. Both Christianity and Islam are monotheistic faith. What makes Christianity true in comparison to Islam?
The resurrection. That's easy, because Jesus died and rose from the dead. Do you know the only people in the world who deny that Jesus literally died are the Muslims? I mean, when it comes to scholarship, I mean, Jewish scholars, New Testament scholars, even if they're atheists, agree Jesus was crucified. The only people that don't seem to think Jesus was crucified are the Muslims, because the Quran, written 600 years later, says he wasn't crucified. Well, why should we trust a document written 600 years after the events for what happened 600 years prior, when we have eyewitness testimony at the time of the event that Jesus actually did die? So the biggest difference between Islam and Christianity is who Jesus was. Jesus is God. He's resurrected. And of course, Muslims believe in a strict monotheistic God. Christians believe that Jesus is part of a trinity, in the sense that there's plurality in the Godhead. There's one God, but three persons in the Godhead, which explains why love can exist prior to creation, right? If you're just a theistic God, a rigidly monotheistic theistic God, how can love exist? There's no one to love. But in a trinity, you have a lover, a loved one, and a spirit of love. Love can exist in the nature of the Godhead for all eternity. He doesn't have to create to love. He didn't need to create to love. He had perfect love in the Trinity. And he chose to create, to love, to share love with other creatures. And that's why he chose to create us.
Dr. Frank, do you want to give us some evidence for the resurrection? I mean, I know you touched on that a little bit. Can you give us more evidence for that?
Sure. Well, we alliterate the evidence in a book called Stealing from God. And it's also in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. This book has a summary of some of the evidence in it, Stealing from God. And I'll just give you there's 8 lines of evidence. They all begin with the letter E, okay? And I can't explain them all. It would take too long, but early testimony, New Testament documents written early. There's eyewitness details in the text that we can show only an eyewitness would know. There's embarrassing stories they never would have made up, like running away when Jesus, at the crucifixion, they deny him. Peter denies him. They all run away. The women are the brave ones, right? I mean, what man is going to say he was a coward, why the women were the ones who discovered the empty tomb and stood by Jesus? They wouldn't have invented that, right? They wouldn't have Peter being called Satan by Jesus. They wouldn't have Jesus called a drunkard, demon possessed. They wouldn't have him be considered out of his mind by his own family in Mark chapter 3. All of these are embarrassing details that they never would have invented. And embarrassing details tend to show that these New Testament writers are not inventing the story. They wouldn't make themselves or their heroes look bad if they're inventing it. Number 4, you have excruciating deaths. That's the idea that the apostles, and the fact that the apostles died knowing that Jesus had died and risen from the dead. Now, some people, like some Muslims, will die for Islam. That doesn't prove Islam. Why? Because they haven't witnessed anything. They just have faith that Islam is true. But the New Testament writers actually witnessed Jesus rise from the dead. They saw the risen Jesus. The apostles did. And then they went to their deaths. You see, many people will die for a lie they think is the truth. Nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went to their deaths anyway. Number 5, we have embedded confirmation. This is hard to explain in a short period of time. But if your viewers want to learn more about this, just Google 2 words: undesigned coincidences. Undesigned coincidences. This is the best evidence you've probably never heard of that the New Testament writers are independently witnessing the same historical events. They couldn't have made it up. I call it embedded confirmation, but it's more often known as undesigned coincidences. The sixth, let me see, what number am I on? 5, 6 is the fact that we have expected testimony. This is the idea that there is Old Testament prophecy that points toward the events of the New Testament, like Isaiah chapter 53 or Daniel chapter 9. These are prophecies that point to the events that occurred in the New Testament, particularly to Jesus. And they were written well in advance of Jesus coming to earth. In the case of Isaiah, 700 years in advance. In the case of Daniel, 500, anywhere from 200 to 500 years in advance. Even liberals will agree it's written late, but it's written prior to Jesus. So those prophecies. Number 7 is extra biblical testimony. You get non-Christian writers who are not eyewitnesses, but they somehow get information about the Christians. People like Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, Thallus, Phlegon, and they make brief references to Christians, the disciples in Christianity. And when you add up their references, you get a story congruent with the New Testament. In other words, you get the fact that these people actually believe that Jesus rose from the dead and they were willing to die for that belief. Now, these writers don't say they believe that Jesus died and rose again. If they were, they'd be Christians, but they're saying the disciples believed he died and rose from the dead. And that's pretty good evidence that these people went to their death saying, hey, this guy rose from the dead. We saw it, The 8th line of testimony is the explosive growth of the church out of Jerusalem. It's really hard to explain how the church could emerge out of Jerusalem when it had 2 formidable enemies, the Jews and the Romans, who could have squashed Christianity immediately by just going to Jesus's tomb and taking out his body. They knew where the tomb was. They could have done that. They couldn't do it. Why? Because the tomb was empty. Jesus was still using his body he had resurrected. And they even admit that the tomb was empty. The Jews came up with the story that the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep. That's a bad explanation for at least 2 reasons. Reason number 1, if you're a Roman guard on duty, what happens to you if you fall asleep on duty? You're dead. Number 2, if you're a Roman guard on duty and you fall asleep, how do you know what happened? Right? How do you know the disciples came and stole the body, right? How can you observe this while you're sleeping? You can't. Okay. So it's a stupid explanation. But by coming up with the explanation, they're admitting the tomb's empty. They don't have to invent an explanation for the empty tomb if his body's still in there, right? And so they invent it in order to get them some cover. But they wouldn't have invented it if the tomb still had Jesus's body. They just would have ended Christianity by going to the tomb and taking the body out. So you've got early eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating, embedded, expected, extra biblical, and you have the explosive growth of the church out of Jerusalem to show that Jesus had risen from the dead.
Thank you, Doctor. The next question that we have is, how do we make sense of Genesis 1 and evolution?
Well, it depends on what you mean by evolution. Evolution, if it's true, only explains how subsequent life forms came together. Doesn't explain where the universe came from, why it's fine-tuned, where the first life came from. It only explains subsequent life forms. So if it's true, it only explains that. Now, there's 2 kinds of evolution. There's microevolution, adaptation within a type, and then there's macroevolution, which is adaptation from one type into another. Like, for example, from reptile to amphibian, from amphibian to bird, okay? We've seen microevolutionary changes. We haven't seen macroevolutionary changes. And not only do I think that macroevolutionary changes the evidence for it is not good. I think there's evidence against it. And we lay this all out in the book. I think the fossil record does not comport with macroevolution. It comports with creation. I think that irreducible complexity does not allow something to be modified gradually like macroevolutionary theory requires. I also think that epigenetic information, which is the structure of a body, not just the DNA inside it, won't allow for the adaptation from one type to another, because you can't mutate epigenetic information or the structure of a living thing by mutating the DNA. That epigenetic information isn't mutated by DNA. So even if you were to mutate DNA from now till doomsday, you would never get a new body plan. And even adherents of macroevolution are starting to admit this. That's why in 2016, they had this meeting of the Royal Society, which is a very august scientific affiliation that once had Isaac Newton as one of its members. In November 2016, they called a meeting in London because they said the current theory of macroevolution has problems and we need to come up with a new theory. Well, they all met and admitted the problems, but they didn't come up with a new naturalistic theory because there isn't one. And there are other reasons to say that macroevolution doesn't occur, but let's suppose it does. What would that do for Christianity? Not much. It would cause us maybe to reinterpret how Genesis on Adam and Eve, or were they created literally out of the dust or not, and were they fully formed? That might be interpreted allegorically at that point, but it wouldn't mean that God doesn't exist. It wouldn't mean that the resurrection didn't occur. It wouldn't mean that Christianity is false. It would cause us to reinterpret some aspects of the creation story, but it wouldn't defeat Christianity. The thing that also needs to be remembered is that even if macroevolution is true, the natural laws that drive it still need a creator and a sustainer. So you don't get rid of the need for God because you need someone to create the universe, design the universe, including all the natural laws that drive everything, and keep those natural laws going consistently, persistently, and precisely the way they go in order for anything to exist. Not just macroevolution to exist and progress, but for us to exist here. Imagine if the natural laws, the four great natural forces, which are gravity, strong and weak nuclear forces, and electromagnetism, imagine if those forces changed every 10 minutes. Right? We couldn't exist. Okay. We wouldn't persist. The universe wouldn't persist. Who created those forces and why are they so consistent, persistent, and precise? They seem to be the product of a mind.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. And the next question that we have is something, something that's related to Genesis again. How can we reconcile the evidence for dinosaurs with Genesis?
Well, people ask, why are dinosaurs not in the Bible? There's two responses to that. Number one, they are in the Bible under the land mammals, right? I might ask, why are the hyenas not in the Bible? Nowhere does it say hyenas, right? But they are under the land mammals. Look, the Bible is not a book on taxonomy, which is the study of different types of animals, right? Now, even books on taxonomy don't mention every single animal or type of animal that have ever existed. The Bible is not a book on taxonomy. It's a book that's designed to get you saved and sanctified, according to 2 Timothy 3:16. That's the reason the book exists. It's not to tell you everything about everything, okay? So because it doesn't mention dinosaurs, and by the way, the word dinosaur is a relatively new invention. It came out a couple of centuries ago. Now, some will say, well, maybe it mentions dinosaur in Job when it talks about behemoth. Well, maybe. But the point is that the Bible is not a book that's supposed to tell you about every single animal that ever existed. So I don't know why people would be concerned that the Bible doesn't mention dinosaurs. It doesn't mention a lot of animals, but that's not the purpose of the book. It's not to tell you everything about everything. It's to get you wise unto salvation.
Thank you, Doctor. The next question, it's a very common question that a lot of atheists ask. If God is good, fair, and just, why does he allow suffering and evil?
I don't mean to be too direct, but why does he allow any of us to exist? Because we do evil every day, right? The reason he allows us to exist is because, or let me back up. The reason evil exists is because he's given us free will. And why has he given us free will? Because in order to love, we have the ability to love, but free will also gives us the capacity to do evil, quite obviously. And so without free will, there would be no evil, but there would also be no love. And God has created a universe whereby he's given us free will so we could love. The problem is we can do evil with it. So what does God do? As soon as evil occurs, he sets up a plan to defeat it. And how does he defeat it? He enters the bloodstream of humanity and ultimately rises or comes to earth in the form of Jesus. And he dies after living a perfect life, takes our punishment on himself, resurrects from the dead to show that he's God and to show us that we will ultimately be resurrected. And he says, I can give you my righteousness if you trust in me. If you don't want to trust in me, I will not force you into heaven against your will. If you want to do your own thing, you'll be separated from me for eternity. I'm not going to force you into my presence. But if you do want to be forgiven and given my righteousness, you can do so. You see, in the end of the day, you know what Christianity is, Lloyd? It's really the answer to the problem of evil. That's what it is. It is how God takes evil upon himself so we don't have to bear the brunt of it eternally. That's what it's all about. And so if he's going to give us free will, and he has, evil can happen and does. And what he does is he redeems it by taking it upon himself. Now, we talk a lot about this in the book, Stealing from God. So if you want to go further, you can also go to our website and our YouTube channel, crossexamine.org. There's a lot of videos on this question of evil they can delve into. But evil doesn't disprove God, Lloyd. It actually proves God does exist. Why? Because there'd be no such thing as evil unless there was good, and there'd be no such thing as good unless God existed, in an objective sense anyway. And so evil doesn't disprove God. It may prove there's a devil out there, but it doesn't disprove God, because we wouldn't even know what evil was unless good existed, and we wouldn't know what good was unless God existed. So evil is actually a backhanded argument for God, not an argument against him.
Okay. The final question that we have is, in Christianity, if salvation is by faith and faith comes from hearing, how do we make sense of condemnation of a random tribe in Africa who will never hear the gospel and will never have faith?
Okay, it's really a variation on the question, what about those that have never heard? Right? That's really what the question is. What about those that have never heard? Now, keep in mind, if you think about this question is actually a moral question. What do I mean by that? Because what it's doing is it's implying that God could be immoral because he doesn't get his message of salvation to everyone, right?
True.
So if an atheist is asking this question, I'm saying, by what moral standard are you judging this is a problem? By what moral standard are you saying that God is potentially immoral if he doesn't get his message to everyone? Because if there's no God, nothing's right or wrong, nothing's moral or immoral. Things just happen because there's no purpose to life. There's no meaning to life. There's no objective moral standard beyond us. It's just all our opinion. So in order for you to even bring up the objection, you have to steal from God to argue against him. That's what the whole book, Stealing from God, is about. Okay. But with regard to what about those that have never heard, it is a good question. And we have videos on our website that go into more detail. But the short answer is this. We know people who hear the gospel but don't believe, right? I mean, you can give people the gospel and go, oh, don't want that, don't believe it. Okay, fine. It could be that those that never hear the gospel wouldn't have believed it anyway, right? I mean, that's possible. Now, if you read Paul in Acts chapter 17, when he's talking to the Athenians on Mars Hill, these are unbelievers from Athens. And he says that God has appointed the times and places where people should live so that people would reach out to him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. In other words, according to Paul, it seems that God has so prearranged events that he has determined where people should live so that they will find God if they want him. It could be that people that never hear the gospel wouldn't have believed it anyway. So if that's the case, God is not immoral for not getting his message to everyone, right? He's not getting his message to everyone because some people don't want to hear it. Now, everybody knows there's a God. Everybody knows there's a creator. Why? From the natural revelation we talked about earlier, everybody knows that his invisible qualities and divine characters are clearly seen from what has been made, so that men are without excuse, Paul says in Romans chapter 1. You know from creation, from design, from the moral law written on your heart, that there's a creator. Now, if you take a step toward that creation and want to know more, or toward that creator, God is going to give you the evidence you need to be saved. But if you turn away from what you already know about God and want to go your own way, God is not going to get you more information because that's just going to annoy you anyway. You don't want God. You want to go your own way. So God will leave you alone. You see, unfortunately, many people are looking for God like a criminal is looking for a cop. They don't want God to exist because they want to be God of their own lives. That's why I ask people, Lloyd, it's a good question to use if you're talking to an unbeliever, is this: if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And many times the atheists I ask that question of will say no. They don't want it to be true. They don't want there to be a God. Why? Because they want to be God of their own lives. They're not on a truth quest, they're on a happiness quest. And they're just going to do what they want to do. They're going to avoid God, not seek him. So if you seek God, you'll get the information you need to be saved. If you don't seek God and want to go your own way and are lost forever, well, that's what you want. You don't want God. So God wants people to be saved more than we do, right? He says he wants all people to be saved. So what we do is we, as his ambassadors, risk all to get people the gospel, and we leave the results to God. But God is not going to be unjust. There's nobody in heaven or in hell that's going to go, God, I got a raw deal. Okay. If you're only given me more information, I would have believed. No, you wouldn't.
Okay. This is a personal question, Doctor, that I have. Maybe like a follow-up question. How do you speak the truth in love? Because you've been to a lot of college campuses and a lot of people will be very arrogant and aggressive and all that. And how do you deal with that? And can you give us some tips or something like that?
Well, I think what we all need to remember is that when someone is asking you a question or someone disagrees with what you believe, I don't know why we should expect that people should believe as we do. Why would, if I'm on a college campus and some college young person gets up to the microphone and disagrees with me, why should I expect him or her to agree with me? I shouldn't, right? So I think one thing we have to have in mind is our expectation. Why should we expect everybody to agree with us? When I was his age, I didn't believe what I believe now. So why should I expect this kid now to believe what I believe now? That's number one. Number two, as Paul says in 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy, I think he says it in 1 Timothy, he says, I was an insolent and arrogant man, but God showed me mercy and grace. In other words, if God can show us mercy and grace, we ought to be able to show mercy and grace to people who don't believe. Notice, Jesus never berated anybody for not believing in him. He had compassion on people and he tried to bring them along, but he didn't scold people. He didn't even scold the emissary of John the Baptist. You remember when John the Baptist is in prison and he sends a guy to see Jesus and he says, hey, I'm here for John. And John's wondering, are you the true Messiah or should we wait for somebody else? Because John's having doubts in prison. Now, what does Jesus say? He doesn't say, you tell John to just have faith and stop asking questions. What's wrong with him? No, he doesn't say that. What does he say? He says, look at the signs, look at the evidence. Basically, he's saying, look at the, he's giving him an apologetic argument. He's saying, look at the evidence. I am the Messiah because I raise people from the dead. I heal sickness. I have power over nature, right? He is the Messiah. Those are the problems we have in life. We get sick, we die, and nature can hurt us as well. Well, Jesus has power over all those things. Those are all his miracles are in those categories. He heals the sick. He raises the dead. He calms nature. He's the Messiah. So he's the one that wants us saved. And we have to keep in mind that we're his ambassadors here. We're here to bring the message, and we shouldn't expect everybody to agree with us. And so if you have that in mind when people attack you or when people disagree with you, you go, okay, I get it. That's fine.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, with this, we'll close the live session. So we just want to thank each and everyone for joining this live. So we'll be attaching a few links in the description of Cross-Examine and his book, his brilliant book that you can actually go and order and go check that out. And you can check our contents in our channel too. We'll be posting a lot of contents related to apologetics, theology, culture, and music, and much more. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. God bless.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you so much.
All right. God bless you guys.